Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is going to require a little bit of a disclaimer. So this is the Auribus Acoustics Sierra. It's an open back dynamic driver headphone that is available for pre-order now and is shipping in like late September, early October timeframe. And more interestingly, I think this is a good example of a trend in audio that I like, which is like these hobbyist headphone makers making the headphone of their dreams and bringing it to market, making it available for people like you and I to purchase. And that's what we've got here with the Sierra. Now, like some of those other headphones, think the Modhouse Tungsten or the DMS Project Omega. Like some of those other headphones, there's some things you got to consider with a headphone like the Sierra here. It's a 3D printed headphone. It's made in small, very small numbers, small batches, handmade, and because of that, the price is on the high end. Here with the Sierra, the retail price is coming in at $900. You can pre-order it for a little bit cheaper right now, but think of this as a $900 headphone. And you might be thinking, well, why would I get a headphone like this? It's made of 3D printed plastic versus something like a Meze Audio 109 Pro or a Focal Clear. And I think that's a fair question, but I think to really understand this genre of audio, you have to consider that one, you're supporting a thing that's interesting, but also these guys are making headphones that they're doing something that a lot of audio manufacturers aren't really doing, which is making headphones with Sennheiser type mid-range, but bass extension. Why is no one else doing this? I don't know, but these hobbyists like Auribus are taking it upon themselves to do it, and they're delivering a headphone like this. Now, why this particular headphone needs a bit of a disclaimer for myself is that Auribus Acoustics is a guy named Juan. I know Juan. I've known Juan for about 5 years. In fact, this particular headphone, I've been kind of talking with him as he's been building the Sierra over the past year and a half. I've heard various versions of it. I've given him feedback on it, and ostensibly some of that feedback has found its way into this final product. So probably that biases me in at least some ways, if not multiple ways, but at least you know. That said, shout out to Juan for loaning me this headphone for the past month or so. I've been listening to it and comparing it with some other headphones, and today we're going to talk about what I think of this headphone. And let's start by diving to the table, and let's just talk about what you get inside your package when you buy a Auribus Acoustics Sierra. This is what you get. You get a carry case, which is kind of like a semi-hard shell carry case, kind of standard, but a little bit on the compact side, which I appreciate. Although note that in terms of how compact it is, it's like so compact that this thing barely fits in it. But I actually kind of prefer that versus something that's larger, that's maybe a little bit loose and floppy. So there you go. You also get this case or this cable. I actually wonder if everyone gets a business card, if that was just me. Hopefully you get a business card. But you also get this cable, which as far as headphone cables go, I actually think this is a pretty decent option. Although as far as like IM cables go, I don't love this. So yeah, most headphone cables the behavior on them is kind of awful. I don't know why. And sometimes they're like way too long. For me, I like a short portable cable. If you like a longer cable, maybe you hate me for saying that, but I prefer like a 4-foot cable. And that's what we've got here with this cable, which I appreciate. What I don't so much love about this cable is that the construction on it, it's a lot like an IM cable. That much I don't mind. It's got like a braided style, but the manufacturer on this cable is Open Heart. I believe you can maybe even see their logo on this. And I've used their cables in the past before. I find them to be just a little bit kink prone, a little bit maybe like over tight. And you can kind of see that that is the case here with this cable. Again, versus like your average headphone cable, it's still a lot better behaved, but it's not my favorite cable, to say the least. What I do like about this headphone cable though, is that it uses your standard dual 3.5 millimeter entry. So you can obviously, if anything goes wrong with this cable or you just want to replace it with another cable you like better, which is personally what I've done, it's very easy. There's a lot of headphones that use this exact same dual entry mode. So it's easy to find replacement. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that it's got a chin cinch on it, which is what you would expect of an IM cable, but not so much of a headphone cable. So it's an interesting choice that that's still included. Neither a problem, but also kind of not super a benefit. And then the last thing I will mention is that this one came with a 4.4 mil cable. I checked on Auribus Acoustics website. I did not see an option to select anything other than a 4.4. Maybe if you reach out to Juan personally and ask him for something else, he'll give it to you. But as far as I can tell, this is a 4.4 mil cable, which also, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of. I'm not a big balance guy. Although this headphone is a little bit on the hard to drive side. So if you're using this on a portable source, you could actually benefit from having that extra power. But other than that, that's going to leave us to talk about the headphone itself. And let's do that. And let's address the elephant in the room. This thing is 3D printed, made out of plastic, and that has some both negative but also some positive sides to it. So the reason that this headphone and other headphones in this ilk are made of 3D printed materials is because that is the materials and the processing that small manufacturers have access to. It means that there's a lot of plastic on this thing. Obviously, for $900, you might expect more premium materials, but this is what you get. And that's going to be the case whether it's this headphone, whether it's the MS Omega, or even the $2,000 Mod House Tungsten. It just is what it is. And now the materials that he's using, I don't know a lot about 3D printing. If you know much about 3D printing, maybe this means more to you. This is, I believe on the website, described as an SLS nylon. It is a nicer 3D printed material than a lot of 3D printed materials that I've touched. It does have a little bit of flex to it, a little bit of give to it. But I do also wonder and kind of question how durable it will be in the long term. That said, I've got one of Juan's earlier headphones. It's a couple years old at this point, and that one's held up fine. So maybe I shouldn't worry too much, but something you should consider. The other thing to consider is just kind of what it means for the feel and the aesthetic of this headphone. I don't know how well this will come across on camera, but you can kind of see the 3D printed patterning that you get in the material. That's pretty common. The texture on it, well, there is a texture to it. It's not like a perfectly smooth ABS plastic or anything like that. That said, I think that Juan's actually done a pretty good job with the fit and finish on this thing, given the materials it's made out of. Like, it doesn't have any sharp edges. There's nothing that catches if I move this along my table. It's not like picking at the felt on it. And that also carries through for like my t-shirt and my hair and stuff like that, right? Generally, it's a pretty polished experience given that it is a 3D printed headphone. But yeah. The other thing that we should talk about, and this is probably the biggest benefit of using these materials, is the weight. So the weight on the Sierra is, I believe, 340 grams, which puts this within like the weight range of kind of a high-end Bluetooth headphone, right? So AirPods Max are actually heavier than this headphone. But if you're looking at your average hi-fi headphone, it's probably going to be heavier than this is, or the AirPods Max. So that's kind of nice. And that has benefits for comfort, which I guess we can talk about. I'll throw this thing on my head and kind of see how it fits. And the first thing that stands out to me about the way that this headphone fits is it's just really snug, and it kind of feels like strapping into a motorcycle helmet in a good way. You know, the headband is rigid, right? It doesn't have kind of like the collapsing flex of, let's say, a Sennheiser headphone, or just frankly most headphones. It fits a little bit more like a Focal headphone in that way. And because of that, you know, if your headphone or your head is of various sizes, that could end up being a problem for you. Like, this might end up being too clampy if you've got a head wider than mine, or it's even possible that it might not clamp well enough if you've got a head that is significantly narrower than mine. I would say that my head width, we're gonna call my head a headphone today. My head width is it's about average, I suppose. But there you go. What did I want to go with this? I mean, in terms of like fit security, this thing's like, it feels really stable, which is why I like it. I mentioned it kind of feels like strapping into a motorcycle helmet, and I like that aspect of it. The other thing that's nice about this is the pads. There is a lot of room in this pad, both top to bottom, left to right, and especially in terms of depth. And that just means that comfort-wise, I actually really like the way that this headphone fits. Anything else I wanted to mention? Not really in terms of the physical form factor, so I guess that's just going to lead us into talking about the sound here on the Auribus Sierra. Let me figure out my situation over here, and let's pull up the frequency response. So this is the frequency response graph as measured on my rig, and I don't have my normal target up here because I feel like this is probably easier for you to relate to. The dotted line that you have back there is actually my measurement on the same rig of my Sennheiser HD600. This is like my favorite headphone. Just to kind of put into context where Juan has tuned the Sierra Open, you can see that mid-range wise, it aligns pretty similarly with the HD600. This is, I would say, a very well-tuned mid-range, if I'm being honest. So what you have is, somewhat of a forward upper mid-range tune like the Sennheiser HD600. You have treble that is tuned, I think, within range of it, although we'll talk about that head-to-head comparison in a little bit. And maybe a little bit of thinness down here in the lower mid-range versus something like the HD600. The HD600 can kind of have like this full body warmth to it. The Auribus Sierra that we've got here does have a little bit more of a cleaner lower mid-range to it. But then what you get on it is this bass extension. And if you're used to looking at frequency response graphs of open back headphones, this bass extension is not what you normally get, right? That is what Juan does with his headphones. And that's what he's done here with the Sierra. Now, how does this actually sound to my ear? I would say sound signature wise, I would describe this as actually sounding very mid-rangey, very neutral, but it has that nice clean sub bass boost. It is maybe a little bit lean in the lower mid-range, but it does also have, and we can see that in the frequency response graph, a little bit of a hump at around 1 kilohertz. And what I think that does is it contributes to kind of filling out some of that leanness in the lower mid-range, but also giving it kind of like this low contrast mid-rangey sound, which is a sound that personally I like a lot. Overall, I would say that's generally like a forward mid-range. The treble up top is not especially lively, but it's definitely not a dark treble. I would just kind of describe the treble as frankly pretty neutral, but it's really just then supported and bookended by that really impressive sub bass extension. I would say that the mid-range tuning on this thing, it just has like a nice ease to it. Again, that low contrast sound just gives it this nice ease. It's not overly clinical and it's not overly aggressive at all. It just has this very easy, transparent sound. But what I like about it versus some other headphones that I might describe in a similar way, thinking like Hyphamens, is that despite it having kind of that lightweight, easy forward mid-range sound, it still has a good sense of body to it. I'm guessing that bass extension is contributing to that. But if I'm just thinking about how the mid-range sounds, it sounds full-bodied. It doesn't have like that clinical weightlessness to it that I really like. The treble on this, I wouldn't describe as like being light and plucky, like you're thinking, a planar treble that has really, really sharp transients. That's not really the treble tuning that we've got here with the Sierra. I would say that nonetheless, the imaging is actually really, really nice in this thing. But if you're looking for that very clear distinction between instruments and sounds and space and stuff like that, that's not so much where the Sierra excels. It still does a really good job of giving me a wide stereo image. It's just not like that contrasty black and white separation between sounds, if that makes sense. And I think part of that is, again, from that low contrast kind of full mid-range sound that, again, is a characteristic I really like. I would say that the transient attack on things does have a little bit of a softness because of that, but frankly, I prefer that to like an overly sharp, aggressive treble. It does just give it kind of a more cohesive, full sound versus something like the digital kind of sound that you'll get out of some Hyphamen planers. And then, yeah, just the last thing to comment on the sound subjectively is that bass quality, which is really, really quite standout and impressive on this headphone. Now, what I will say is that I've heard various versions of this headphone, again, over the past year and a half, and I think that this final version is not the best bass that he was able to get. I think the last version he had like a snappier transient. It was like a cleaner percussive hit to like kick drums and stuff like that. But he did some damping with the treble that actually had the effect of slightly softening transients across the board, including with the bass. That said, it's still a lot sharper and better defined than the bass that you're gonna get on most open back headphones. And personally, given what it did with the treble, I think it was a fair trade-off. Yeah, so let's just bring in some other headphones for some direct comparison. I know that these are not necessarily price-wise the kind of headphones you might be thinking about comparing. This is the Hyphamen Edition XS. This one came out at around $500 when it initially launched, and now you can get it for around $300, right? So a lot cheaper than what you can get this headphone for. But I bring this on the table because under $1,000, legitimately, this is one of my two favorite headphones. I like this better than most other headphones that are closer to the $1,000 price range. In terms of this comparison, I think something like the Edition XS is going to give you those sharper transients that I talked about this being a little bit soft on. The delineation between sounds, the separation, again, that clean kind of contrasty space between sounds is where the Edition XS excels and not necessarily where the Sierra excels. I would say that the treble on this thing is also just a lot more prominent. This is going to be the brighter headphone, clearly, in listening impressions, and probably that is contributing to that delineation between sounds. But there is, because of that, a little bit of an unnaturalness to the treble on the Edition XS. I think it does a really good job with high frequency percussion. Think hi-hats and cymbals and drum brushes and stuff like that, I think is where the Edition XS does a really fantastic job. But with maybe lower tone, high frequency stuff, it's where it can sound a little bit unnatural and a little bit digital sounding. Just kind of a trade-off that the Edition XS makes for that. Whereas the Sierra, I think, leans more in the sounding natural more consistently, but trades off some of that, again, that pluckiness and that delineation. And then in terms of overall tuning, this is where it's actually kind of interesting, because I think that the Sierra is tuned more like mid-range forward. It reminds me more of the Sennheiser HD600 than the Edition XS tuning does. And yet there is like kind of like a bodilessness to the way that Hyphaman sound comes through. Like if I'm listening to these in comparison directly, there is like, this kind of has like a thicker tonal balance to the lower mid-range, but it nonetheless feels like there's less body behind it. It's kind of a hard thing to describe. If I were to describe it or to explain it with frequency response, I would guess that it's because of kind of the recessed like 1 to 2 kilohertz that you get here with the Hyphaman tuning. But it is what it is. Like, again, the mid-range is decent here on the Edition XS, but it is not what it is excellent with, whereas that is what I think the Sierra is excellent with. Now, where I think these headphones are maybe more comparable is in terms of their imaging width. So the imaging precision, positional stuff, definitely the Edition XS has the advantage, but in terms of presenting a picture, like an audio picture that is wider than my head, both of these do a really outstanding job. And that's where I think this is kind of like comparable to the Edition XS, and where I think this headphone kind of comes into play. So this is the Sennheiser HD600. And again, not the same ballpark in terms of price range, but my favorite headphone under $1,000, easy. And why I kind of bring these two headphones up is that the Sierra kind of reminds me of, or makes me think of what it would sound like if you combined the strengths of this headphone with the strengths of this headphone, and you get the Sierra. So let's talk about that. So the strength of the Sennheiser HD600 is the mid-range. It is just this very full, forward, but just richly textured mid-range. And I think that the Sierra actually approaches that. It's not exactly the same presentation, but it's frankly pretty similar, to the point that listening to this guy, like it gives me kind of those same mid-rangey vocal vibes that I get with the HD600. Now, what's interesting is that I actually find the HD600 to sound more trebly versus this guy. And I don't necessarily, I would describe the treble in this as more or less neutral. So it was interesting to me to hear this thing in direct comparison and think that the HD600 actually sounded a little bit on the bright side. Now, in terms of imaging width, that is where the HD600 is not super strong. It's not really a big problem for me. Like, again, this is still nonetheless my favorite headphone under $1,000, but going to something like the Edition XS, that's why it makes it fun to have something like the Edition XS, is that you put that headphone on and it just hits you with that impressive head stage. I think that the Sierra Open does a very comparable job to the Edition XS, and a much better job than what you get here on the HD600. So I think you get kind of like a similar mid-range tilt to this headphone, but you just get that more impressive wide imaging on this headphone. Now, the last headphone I'll bring in for a comparison is this one. This one is more comparable in terms of price. This is the Meze Audio 99, no, not the 99 Classics, the 109 Pro. Also open back headphone. Price on this thing is, I believe, around $800. Now, obviously, build quality materials, this thing is a cut above the rest. This is one of the most beautiful headphones that money can buy. Excellent materials and stuff like that. Now, unfortunately, in terms of sound, it's not quite there. In terms of tonal balance, it reminds me a lot of the aforementioned Hyphamen. It's a little bit thick in the lower mid-range, a little bit recessed in the vocal region, and that kind of gives it like this like warm sounding, but also slightly bodiless sound. Where I think this thing is actually worse than the Edition XS is in terms of the treble performance. It's a little bit over spicy. And because of that, I find this one kind of difficult to listen to for long listening sessions. Whereas something like the Auribus Sierra, no problems with it at all. This one just ends up being more mid-rangey, more comfortable in the treble by far, and much better bass extension too. So while I love and appreciate the build quality in this guy, that's what you're paying for. If you're looking for just kind of that mid-rangey sound that gives you that fan favorite Sennheiser mid-range, but with imaging width, well, that's where this headphone shines. Now, that's going to lead us into wrapping up this review, and I can't give this one a score. Again, I'm a little bit biased for this, right? But nonetheless, I've really enjoyed my time with this headphone. Again, shout out to Juan for loaning me this headphone. In fact, just to give you a sense of like how much I enjoy this headphone, I've pre-ordered it myself. And if you're interested in pre-ordering one, well, I've got Juan linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Joined with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this